Numbers. So if you'll turn to Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, I want to begin with a quote from Bill MacDonald in his commentary on Numbers. He says, "Christians should not think that this book is dry Jewish history." A lot of people get really scared when they hear the word Numbers and they hit those chronological genealogy counting sections in chapters 1 through 4. This is not dry Jewish history. It is full of applications to the modern Christian experience. It would be pleasant to think that all or most Christians advance swiftly from salvation to a full entering into God's promises of victory. However, observation and experience show how much we resemble the ancient Israelites in complaining, backsliding, and rank unbelief. So after we get through the Numbers in the beginning of the book, we're going to hear the story of Israel. And this is a story of what I just read there: complaining, backsliding, unbelief. Sounds like a typical church in America in 2021. A spiritual war, a spiritual battle that is being waged in the hearts and the lives of the people of God. So let's talk a little bit about the title. You'll notice that just like the other books of the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch, in the Law, we see the title is not based off of the Hebrew in our Bible. We call it Numbers, which the Greek word on the screen is arithmoi. What does that sound like? What English word? Arithmoi. Arithmetic. Numbers. See, you know a Greek word. And yet the Hebrew word is bemidbar. And that word is the first word of the book, which means ba in midbar, the wilderness. So the first word in Hebrew is the title of the book, ba in midbar, in the wilderness. However, in our English Bible, we have named it after what the Septuagint named it, and that is, of course, the title given because of all of the number counting in those chapters. Now, I think the title In the Wilderness is a far better title than the title Numbers. Notice in Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, it says, Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness. And that's where they're going to spend the next 40 years. In the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they had come up out of the land of Egypt. So the book of Numbers is a book about the wilderness experience of Israel. They're more in the wilderness in Numbers than they are in any of the other books of the Old Testament. And it takes the reader from Sinai, Mount Sinai, all the way to the Jordan River, ready to enter the Promised Land. So it's a very important book in the history of Israel. So we go from the giving of the law up to the conquest as it starts. The NIV Study Bible gave a really good title for us as English readers to think of. They titled this book, A Tale of Two Generations of Israelites, One Faithless, One Faithful. So we're going to see the faithless generation, the first years of the wandering in the wilderness. And then we'll hear the story of the faithful generation as well, mixed in to this book. So it's a book about faithfulness in the wilderness, as well as faithlessness in the wilderness. So it's about God's faithfulness to his people. He does this by providing for them in the wilderness. What are some of the things God provided for Israel in the wilderness? Manna, food, daily bread. What else? Water, right? In the dry land. What else? Quail. See stories about quail. Yeah, the guidance of the presence of God, the Shekinah glory, the pillar of fire, and the cloud that they're able to follow. And so he makes them a great nation as well in the wilderness. He is fulfilling his covenant to Abraham. In spite of their unfaithfulness, God's going to be faithful. But he is also going to be raising up a faithful people. You think there were spies that were supposed to enter the Promised Land. And most of them were faithless, but two were what? Who were they? Joshua and Caleb. They were faithful spies. So this is a book about faithfulness, and it is a tale of the faithless and the faithful in the wilderness. So that's kind of a really quick thought on the title and the overview. So who is the author of the book? Well, we've already really spent a lot of time demonstrating Moses' authorship. I think we see this in particular in chapter 33, where it says there, as right after we are getting through the wilderness narratives, and it talks about the itinerary of what Israel went through in the wilderness. It says there, Moses wrote down their starting places, stage by stage, by the command of the Lord. And these are their stages according to their starter places. Also, we read the expression, the phrase, thus says, or the Lord says to Moses, or the Lord commanded Moses, more than 60 times in the book. So, internally, good evidence, Moses was in fact the author of this book. Also, the New Testament quotes Numbers, events that happened in Numbers, and attributes them to Moses many different times. We see this in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, when Jesus talks about Moses and the serpent in the wilderness. We see this, of course, in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 10. We'll look at that at the end of this session. And we also see it in Acts chapter 7. If you remember, Stephen, that young, fiery deacon in the church, is preaching the gospel. He's preaching his own funeral sermon. He's about to be stoned. And so he's giving his own funeral sermon in Acts chapter 7. And he's talking about God's faithfulness to an unfaithful people in the Old Testament. Sound familiar? The message of Numbers. And in Acts 7, he says there to the religious leaders, you took up the tent of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship. And so I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. Now notice this. Our fathers had the tent of witness in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it, according to the pattern he had seen. So the whole wilderness scenario was spoken to Moses. It was directed to Moses. In particular, the pattern of the tent and the witness of the wilderness mission. So, the date of this book. If we know that Moses is the author, we know it's taking place in the wilderness. We know, anyone remember the actual date that I gave for the Exodus from Egypt? 1446. That's the date that we go with. We think that's a very helpful date, an accurate date, and we kind of looked at the chronology when we were looking at the intro to Exodus. So, basically, this book starts off on the Sinai narrative, which is found in Exodus 19 and goes all the way to Numbers 10. So Numbers chapters 1 through 10 are a part of a big narrative at the base of Mount Sinai, at the giving of the law. So all of last session, the whole book of Leviticus, part of the Sinai narrative. Exodus 19 forward, Sinai narrative. Numbers 1 through 10, Sinai narrative. And then they finally leave Sinai, Mount Sinai. They break camp in Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 through 12. They arrive at the southern border of the Promised Land in chapter 12, but they do not enter because they rebel against the Lord's command and they don't have faith. So they spend 38 years of wandering in the wilderness. And then the closing chapters of Numbers will tell us how the people set out again after they reach the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross in. And it's there, at the banks of the Jordan River, at the end of Numbers, that they're going to receive the book of Deuteronomy. All right, Deuteronomy is going to be given. A copy of the law is going to be repronounced to the people, and then they'll be able to enter the land in the book of Joshua. So again, all the way from Exodus 19 to Numbers 10, Sinai narrative, right after they get out of Egypt in 1446. And then from Numbers 10 on, you have 40 years approximately of wandering in the wilderness. So to summarize this in a helpful way, Numbers covers the time period between 13 months after the Exodus, a little over a year after the Exodus at Mount Sinai, to the end of the 40 years of wandering, meaning that the book was probably penned around the year 1405 BC. Probably a similar time to when Deuteronomy is also penned, of course. The book of Numbers, yeah. So 1405. So it covers 38 years from Mount Sinai till they're ready to enter the promised land the second time. And it was probably written, the completion of the book is 1405 BC. So it couldn't have been completed till at least then. So Exodus, 1446, 1405, Numbers is probably written around that point, as is Deuteronomy, we'll see tonight as well. Any questions on date and just authorship? Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Let's think for a minute about the structure of the book, how the book is broken down. So chapters 1 through 10 are still a part of the Sinai narrative. They're at Mount Sinai. They're preparing to go and make the march to Canaan. So chapters 1 through 4 are the famous number chapters where the people are divided up by their tribes and their numbers of men are given. And then in chapters 5 through 10, we see the text that talks about how the people were prepared, holiness, purified, to enter the land of Canaan. So then, so we start out Sinai, chapters 1 through 10. Then we have the journey to Kadesh, when they're preparing to enter the promised land in chapters 10 through 12. They are Bab Midbar. They're in the wilderness. Finally, they leave Mount Sinai. They're in the wilderness. Then we see the rebellion in chapters 13 through 19 with the spies, with the people rebelling against God and not having faith. Then they're going to journey from the boundaries of Canaan through the plains of Moab, and you're going to have from chapters 22 to 36 the death of the old generation that left Egypt, and now the new generation is going to take over. So you're going to have two different generations in one book in 38 years. That happens. I mean, I've been at this church 16 years, and I've actually seen almost 3 generations in 16 years come through as a pastor. And so you're talking 38 years, no modern medicine, not the greatest living conditions in the wilderness. Very easy to see how there would be multiple generations that could go. Then inside of chapters 22 to 36, we do see an interesting little interlude. There's a section about God and a false prophet named Balaam. And we'll just touch on that very briefly tonight, but it's actually very comical. You know, there is humor in the Bible. That's a humorous section, really. And then we'll see the organization of the new generation getting ready to enter the promised land at the end of the book. So this book is showing God's faithfulness over Israel. The Israelites are now being organized. Remember Numbers, chapters 1 through 4. They're being put together into an army of God who are to follow their king to victory. But they fail the test. They are unfaithful to their king. So when Moses is writing this book in the year 1405, after Israel has failed God in the wilderness, this is a message to the younger generation. This is a message to the next generation. Exodus was the message to the generation that came out of Egypt, right? Numbers and Leviticus was as well. Those were messages to that first generation that came out of Egypt. Numbers and Deuteronomy are messages to the next generation that's going to enter the promised land. Very important. And it's going to tell them not to imitate the unbelief of their parents. All right, that's a sad message. Don't be like your parents. That's exactly what Numbers is telling the people, how their parents failed them. So let's talk about numbers, which arithmoi, the Greek word for numbers. Let's talk about them in the book. So the first numerical introduction summary we have is in chapter 1. We have a summary of how many men are in the people of Israel ready to go to war. And it's very important to think about this because there's a lot of debate about the numbers in the Bible. And basically there's 3 approaches. Approach 1 is that when you read these numbers, these are literal numbers. If it says, as you're going to see in verse 46, 603,000 people, there were 603,000 people. Some people are going to read this symbolically. And when they ever read the word thousand, they are going to interpret the word thousand, which is the Hebrew word elef. All right, I've got that up there. It can also mean a company, a family, or a clan. And so they're going to interpret this in a symbolic way. So for instance, Reuben is said, the tribe of Reuben, one of the 12 tribes, to have 46,500 people in chapter 1, verse 21. Rather than read it as 46,000 people, they're going to read it as 46 families. Not 46,000, but 46 families, which would total more like 500 people than 46,000 people, okay? So they're going to interpret it in a more symbolic way. Others are going to read these numbers and say that this is deliberate hyperbole. This is exaggeration. The authors are exaggerating to, you'll read this in evangelical study Bibles. The authors are exaggerating to show how great and faithful God is to his promises, which I would say doesn't sound very great or faithful if you have to exaggerate and make it up. We teach our kids that exaggeration is not a virtue. It's called lying, right? It's the 9th commandment, bearing false witness. Now, I'm a literal guy. I think these are literal numbers. I don't think there's any reason to escape from them. But I'm going to show you why some people read them symbolically in particular, or even hyperbolically, and why I think that's unhelpful. So, we start off, the first generation, Numbers chapters 1 through 4. Notice the summary in verses 45 and 46. It says there, so all those listed of the people of Israel by their fathers' houses, from 20 years old and upward, every man able to go to war, were listed at 603,550. So they're at Mount Sinai. They do this statistical survey, and they say there's 603,000 men that can go to war. Fast forward. After chapters 1 through 4, the boring Numbers chapters, you get another Numbers chapter, chapter 26. And in chapter 26, they're about to enter the promised land. And look what the summary is there. 26:51. The list of the people of Israel was 601,730. Now, you read that, and okay, that's a lot of men. It's a lot of people. But when Israel actually enters the promised land under Joshua, and they go into the city of Jericho, look at Joshua 4:13 on the screen. It says there, about 40,000 men were ready for war and passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. So skeptics and people that are doubting the integrity of Scripture read that, and they say, Joshua is saying only 40,000 men could go to war. Numbers is saying 600,000 men could go to war. We've got a discrepancy. So maybe the author of Numbers was talking symbolically or hyperbolically, and the writer of Joshua is more literal. Well, I don't think that's a good way to synthesize the Bible at all. It doesn't say that only 40,000 were ready for war, does it? It says about 40,000 were ready for war. It doesn't say only 40,000 men could be called up to go to war, does it? It's very important when you read the Bible not to read into it something that's not there. Listen, how many men could go to war in the United States of America right now? I would assume millions could go to war. How many are actually trained and in the military? And let's start there, right? Well, now we just knocked the number down by millions. Now let's go a step further. There's a difference between being in the military and being prepared to be deployed, correct? Big difference. You know anything about the military, you know that firsthand. So now you've got a whole nother qualification there of people. So now you went from millions in the military services to a very small number, relatively speaking. Just because it says there was 40,000 that marched into Jericho doesn't mean that's all that was available, correct? So I don't think this is a Bible discrepancy. I don't think you need to be ashamed of the numbers. Readily true, the numbers are sometimes hard in the Bible to understand. But I think we just have to receive them by faith. I don't think we have to rewrite the Bible or try to symbolize the numbers. Because if you are doing that, let's say you're using the idea of that instead of 1,000, it means a family or a clan. So now you've got, so for instance, the example I gave was what? Chapter 1, verse 21, 46,500 people in Reuben, which would just mean 46 families. Or if you do that here in Numbers, then you only have 601 families. That's not very many, is it? And then when you do that, if you do that consistently in Joshua, you've only got 40 families that are going to go marching instead of 40,000. See, there's no end to what you might do to the text of Scripture when you begin to misuse what God has written, to maybe apologize or make it more palpable. So I think we should just accept it by fact. Any questions on that concept? There's a lot of numbers in the book, and it's important to say, hey, I think we should take it pretty literally.
I took it that when I was reading numbers about Benjamites, you have Benjamin, and the tribe was knights, and into their names, you know.
That's funny.
Those numbers were literal.
Right.
What they were.
And when I read through those sections, I'm a big underliner in my Bible, so the way I stay awake in chapters 1 through 4, just honest confession, is I always underline the name of the tribe. If there's a leader, the leader of the tribe, and I underline the number. Helps me to stay awake mentally, not get lost. Helps you to kind of, now I can find quickly the statistics if I needed them. But yeah, I think so. I think we would read this just like we would read any other text. It would be weird for there to be this like hyperbole in the first 4 chapters of a narrative book and then everything else to be literal. It just doesn't, it's not how you would normally read a piece of literature. Now, let's talk about Jesus and numbers, and then we've got to jump into Deuteronomy. So I think the New Testament borrows heavily from the book of Numbers to help us see Jesus. So when Israel is in the wilderness, they worship where? The tabernacle. We've already seen this allusion a couple weeks back. The whole point of the Gospel of John, right, is the Word, Jesus, became flesh and he dwelt, he tabernacled among us. It's a big theological theme. We've already seen that. But a more clear allusion to Numbers, turn to John chapter 3, please. Turn to John chapter 3. If you were here Sunday morning for Resurrection Sunday, you saw this tie-in. I want you to notice it again. John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, a great teacher of the Jews, a rabbi, a leader of the Jews, a Pharisee, who had come to him by night. And in John 3, verses 14 and 15, Jesus says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have eternal life." So now turn back to Numbers chapter 21, please. Go to Numbers 21 and look there. You see this story in Numbers. Jesus is using Numbers to teach the gospel. He sees himself in Numbers, just like we saw in Genesis, that Abraham took Isaac, his only son, to Mount Moriah to offer him as a what? Sacrifice. And God provided a substitute. Just like at the Passover in Exodus, we saw very clearly there that there was a lamb whose blood had to be shed and it had to be applied for the wrath of God to pass over the firstborn of each home. Just like we saw last week in Leviticus, with the sacrificial system. In particular, remember the Day of Atonement and the scapegoat and the regular goat, and how one took the sins of Israel away. The other was the propitiation. The blood was poured out. The wrath of God was covered over the sins of the people. In the same way, Numbers has these same stories that are pointing forward to Jesus. So look at Numbers 21, verses 4 through 9. They journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. That sounds like us, doesn't it? Now, none of you have ever suffered about discouragement. Now, the question is, what do you do with it? And the people spoke, here's the dangerous thing, against God and against Moses. Not only did they blame God, who had redeemed them, they also blamed God's man. Don't be surprised if you're living for God and someone else is hurt or discouraged. They don't just attack God, they attack you. It does happen. Guilt by association. Jesus said if they hated the master, they're going to hate the servant. Now, so the people became very discouraged. They spoke against God and against Moses. And this is what they said: "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no food and no water. Our soul loathes" what? "This worthless bread." The New King James translates it. That is so nice, isn't it? Sounds like a kid being served broccoli or something, doesn't it? Or asparagus or whatever. Brussels sprouts, that would be a good one for, serve a 10-year-old Brussels sprouts and see how excited they are normally. So, or some adults, Brussels sprouts for that matter, too. Who was it? George H.W. Wasn't he broccoli? George H.W., yeah. So, this stuff is worthless. That's spitting in the face of God who provided, right? Which, by the way, manna tasted good. It was sweet. It was a blessing to eat manna. So the Lord, notice this, verse 6. Now remember, this is not in a vacuum isolated. There is a lot of backstory to this, of rebellion and unfaithfulness. But the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. Where did we first see a serpent in the Bible? Garden of Eden, Genesis 3, Satan. So the Lord sent fiery serpents. They bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned. We have spoken against the Lord and against you." Now look, they're going to look to Moses as a what? A mediator. Pray to the Lord, pray to Yahweh, he would take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. It's kind of interesting. Before Jesus went to the cross on John 17, and then in the Garden of Gethsemane in John 18, what did Jesus do? He prayed for his people, right? Then the Lord said to Moses, verse 9, so Moses made a bronze serpent, which, by the way, what was brazen in the tabernacle? The offering, right? The altar. The brazen altar. Remember, that's where the blood was shed and poured out, on the brazen altar. So Moses made a bronze or brazen serpent, put it on a pole, and so it was, if a certain serpent had bitten anyone, which means they were as good as dead, they were dying and they were going to die, and they looked at the bronze serpent, they what? They lived. Jesus said, that's me, okay? Read the Old Testament, see me. You're dying, you're dead in your sins, look to me and you live. The Son of Man's going to be lifted up. And he was, and he still is today verbally, and he still is in the heavens as ruling and reigning as king. Look on him and live. So that's one example. If you would, turn to Jude, verse 11. Took to Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, verse 11 in the New Testament. It's right before Revelation. So Jude, probably half-brother of Jesus, writing this general letter to the church. And in Jude, he's going to mention people from Numbers. He's going to make allusions to Numbers. He's going to mention that guy that we said there's an excursion on in chapters 22 to 25, Balaam, was a false prophet. And he's also going to mention a guy named Korah as well. So look at that there, Jude 11. In fact, we'll start at verse 10. Jude, verse 10. So 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, Revelation. But these speak evil of whatever they do not know. He's talking about false teachers and false believers, apostates, people that acted as if they were believers, but they were not. So these speak evil of whatever they do not know. And whatever they know naturally, like brute beasts, like animals, in these things they corrupt themselves. Look at verse 11. Woe to them. They have gone in the way of Cain, allusion to Genesis, chapter 4. They have run greedily in the error of Balaam. Balaam was a false prophet in Numbers, chapter 22 to 25, who prophesied for money. It was all about the Benjamins, dare I say it. That was what he was about, okay? Or the shekels. And then perished in the rebellion of Korah. Now, you have to know the book of Numbers to know about Balaam and Korah. You wouldn't even get this if you didn't know those books. So turn to Numbers chapter 16. We won't look, we just don't have time to read Balaam's account, but I encourage you, if you want homework tonight, go home and read Numbers 22 to 25 and get a good laugh. It's pretty humorous stuff and pretty sober stuff. But Numbers 16, verses 31 to 33. Let's look there. Numbers 16, verses 31 to 33. All right. Actually, let's start at verse 28. So you've got these sons of Korah rebelling against God, and against Moses, and rejecting Moses' leadership. And so Moses said, "By this you shall know that the Lord, that Yahweh has sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them of my own will. If these men die naturally like all men, or if they are visited by the common fate of all men, then Yahweh has not sent me. But if Yahweh creates a new thing, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, then you will understand that these men have rejected Yahweh." Now it came to pass, as he finished speaking all these words, that the ground split apart under them. The earth opened its mouth. This is really catastrophic language. The earth, so we've got almost like an earthquake happening, a sinkhole's opening. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with all their households and all the men with Korah, with all their goods. So they and all those who with them went down alive into the pit. The earth closed over them, and they perished from the assembly. Then all Israel who also were around them fled at their cry, for they said, "Lest the earth also swallow us up." Severe, supernatural judgment, right? If you rebel against God and God's messenger, and you reject God's authority and leadership, there is judgment awaiting you. And Jude is picking up on that, and he's quoting that there. Let's look at 1 Corinthians. Let's turn there. 1 Corinthians. I want us to see chapter 10, and then we'll look at one more spot in Numbers, and then we're going to move on to Deuteronomy. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. This is probably the longest direct section from Numbers. Paul really heavily relies on this section. Now there's others, like Jesus talking about himself being the bread of life and contrasting that with the daily manna that God provided for the Israelites. There's just a lot of stories in Numbers that are repeated in the New Testament. We get a bunch of them here. So it starts off in chapter 10, verse 1, going back to Exodus. "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." Stop right there. Some theologians consider this a waterless baptism, meaning Israel are leaving Egypt. In order to get to Sinai and get the law, they have to cross the Red Sea, and they go down into the water, and they cross the Red Sea, correct? But how do they do it? On dry ground. They don't actually get wet. But it's still like their baptism, their entry into being the people of God. So some people read this because of this passage and say, God redeems Israel in Egypt. He passes over them. The wrath of God is on the Egyptians and on the Lamb, not on the Israelites. And then they're baptized in a waterless baptism as they cross the Red Sea. And then they're given the law of God at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. That's just for extra bonus points. But there's an allusion to Exodus. Now, verse 3, "And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." This is directly from Numbers. God had supplied water and manna in the wilderness in Numbers chapter 11, chapter 14, chapter 16, and 17. All right? From the rock, water came, the manna, the quail. They all ate and drank of the same. Verse 5, "With most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." Ba Midbar, there's the title, in the wilderness. "Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted." So he's saying, hey, learn from what the Israelites did in Numbers. "Do not become idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents." We just read that, Numbers 21. "Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages has come." So you see illustrations from Numbers 21. The issue of sexual immorality, that's from Numbers 25. We don't have time to look there. The point is, this whole sermon from Paul is a Numbers sermon. He's basically just teaching the book of Numbers to the Corinthians and saying, hey, this is all applied in our lives today. We should learn from it. I want us to see one more thing, and then we're going to jump into Deuteronomy. Turn to Numbers 24, please, near the end of the book. This is the Balaam section. We can't study the actual narrative of what happened in Balaam's life, but I do want you to see this little prophecy that I think is so fascinating. So Balaam is hired to curse the people of God. He is a prophet, but he's a false prophet. He's not serving God. He's using his gift for evil. And he is willing to take money to go and curse the people of God. Here's the problem. God is sovereign. And every time he tries to use his gift to curse God, God takes control of him sovereignly, and uses him to bless his people. And Balaam and his boss are not very happy with this because they want Israel dead. But Balaam can't curse God's people because he can't talk outside of God's sovereignty. God's in control. And as he's prophesying, all of a sudden there's this very interesting prophecy in verses 16 and 17. So look, we'll start at verse 15, the introduction to this prophecy. So he took up his oracle, and he said, the utterance or the word of Balaam the son of Beor, the utterance of a man whose eyes are opened, the utterance of him who hears the word of God and has the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. Sounds to me like God revealed himself to this false prophet, and he was powerless, right? Kind of sounds like John in Revelation, just falling down. Or at the Mount of Transfiguration, the apostles falling down like a dead man. Now look what verse 17 says. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but he's not near yet. A star is going to come out of Jacob. A scepter is going to rise out of Israel. So the star is going to appear, and then a scepter is going to rise. What is a scepter a sign of? Power or kingship, right? In the ancient world, leadership, but to be specific, a king. All right, let's think about the birth of Jesus. All right, the Gospels open up. Now, Balaam says, I see him, but not yet. He's coming, but he's not near yet. A star is going to come out of Jacob. What do we see at the birth of Jesus? Star above, that the wise men come to, that the religious leaders in Jerusalem happen to also notice. And what are the Magi looking for? The king that's going to be born, right? Kind of sounds to me like this is a promise of Jesus. And he's seeing Jesus 1,400 years before Jesus comes, and he's describing Christ coming into the world. Just another small, beautiful little tidbit of, hey, man, we can find Jesus all in the Old Testament. This is a very clear prophecy, in my opinion, of the coming of Christ. And then he's going to come and bring judgment on the enemies of the people of God. Now, any questions on Numbers before we jump into Deuteronomy and do a flyover Deuteronomy? What's that? Go for it.
You were saying about how the numbers read it literally with the 600 and 1,000.
Right.
And you mentioned about U.S. 328.2 million are in the U.S. 1.5 million people are in the military, and of that, 900,000 are deployed.
So only 900,000 of 328 million are actually deployed. So there you go. Very small percentage. So thank you for the numbers to back up my idea. I appreciate the backup support there. All right. Any other? That's write those numbers down. That's helpful if you're explaining that to someone. All right, Deuteronomy. Let's talk about Deuteronomy. You can go ahead and turn over to Deuteronomy. So, Deuteronomy. J.A. Thompson has written, Deuteronomy is one of the greatest books of the Old Testament. Its influence on the domestic and personal religion of all ages has not been surpassed by any other book in the Bible. Deuteronomy is a neglected book that should not be, because we're going to see it was the heart of the message of Jesus. So it should not be neglected. It's the heart of our gospel message. Every week when I say, love God, love your neighbor, go in his peace, I'm essentially quoting Deuteronomy every single week. So, and I'm quoting Jesus too, who's quoting Deuteronomy. who wrote Deuteronomy. So this is kind of important. Now, again, the translation Deuteronomy is Greek. It comes from the Septuagint. Devarim is the Hebrew title, which speaks of the words. Devar is word. Davarim is words, plural. So the words is the first two things that are said in the Hebrew. It's the second, Devar or Devarim is the second word of the book in Hebrew. And the English title, Deuteronomy, comes from a compound of two words, deutero and nomos. Nomos is the word for law. So deutero, second. So the Septuagint translated and gave the title of second law, Deuteronomy, to this book, which is actually a mistake. So they did that based off of Deuteronomy 17, verse 18, which says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he will write for himself in a book a Deuteronomy, in the Greek translation, a copy of this law, or a second law, a second word, or a second law approved by the Levitical priest. So they considered this whole book to be a second law, which really, the word actually more means a copy of the law. So remember, the Sinai narrative, Exodus 19 to Numbers 10. After Numbers 10, Israel leaves Sinai. They go and they start heading out to the Promised Land. Deuteronomy picks up with the second generation, not the faithless generation, the faithful generation, ready to enter the Promised Land. And the law is being repeated for them again. It is being re-covenanted again. Again, they're hearing the law as the people of God. Now, Deuteronomy 31, verse 9 tells us Moses wrote this law, and he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, of Yahweh, and all the elders of Israel. So when it says Moses wrote this law, I think it's referring to chapters 1 through 30. And this book claims Moses as an author in multiple places, chapter 1, chapter 4, and chapter 29. Also, the New Testament ascribes the book to Moses. Joshua attributes this book to Moses. In the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 7, he talks about the law of Moses and meditating on it day and night, as if Moses was the author. Here's an example, though, of the New Testament quoting Deuteronomy as the book of Moses. All right? So Paul in Romans 10 is going to quote Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 21. He says there, I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. So clearly, Paul sees Deuteronomy as the words that Moses gave the people of Israel. And again, he's giving it to them as they're about to enter the Promised Land. So Exodus and Leviticus are given at Mount Sinai, at the foot of Mount Sinai, all the way to Numbers chapter 10. After that, from Numbers 10 on, they're in the wilderness. Deuteronomy, 40 years later, 38 years later, they're about to enter the Promised Land the second time. And now Moses is giving them a repeat of the law, a copy of the law again. So this is a message after the wilderness wandering of Numbers. It is a message to the second generation of Israelites as they are on the plains of Moab. Moses is about to die. Now, did Moses write every word in Deuteronomy? We've already said no. Probably not. Probably Joshua came and finished up the edit. The most glaring example of that is what? His own death. He probably did not record his own death. Now, he could have prophetically. It just seems unlikely. It seems more likely that Joshua, who's an inspired writer, comes and completes the book after Moses died and records what happened. I like how the NIV Study Bible summarizes this. It says, the core of the book was first spoken on the plains of Moab. Its literary form was stored beside the Ark of the Covenant, which was to be placed in the central sanctuary in the land of Canaan. But its ultimate destination was meant to be in the lives of the Israelites, written on their individual hearts, in the doorposts of their homes, and their city gates throughout the land. So we're going to see the heart of Deuteronomy is not simply to have a book as an external scroll, but to have the Word of God personally. The heart is to take it to your heart. The heart is not just to have the Bible, the heart, or to have God's Word. The heart is to get it into your heart, to live it, to walk it, to breathe it, really, to meditate on it day and night. That's the heart of this book. So this book has 4 major sections: speeches, sermons from Moses. It talks about the past of Israel, the present of Israel, the future of Israel, and then his final benediction, his final prayer. And then he goes and he dies over the nation of Israel. Now, some people have made a big deal, and I have a little bit in your notes, about how this book follows a treaty form of the Hittite-Suzerain vassal treaties. Don't have time to get into that tonight. If you want to read up on that on your own time, you can. Some people make the claim that this book is written in a special literary form of that era. I think maybe there's some similarity. I mean, Paul uses a literary form, right? What does he do? He writes letters. It's a literary form. David uses a literary form. He writes poetry. So could it be that Deuteronomy follows kind of a legal contract form? Maybe. That's what that was. The Hittite form was a legal form. Maybe. We don't have time to get into that tonight. If you want to read that more, you can have fun on your own. I think it's an interesting concept, but not necessarily important to what we're trying to do. So I think that the heart of this book is found in chapter 4. In chapter 4, we see the heart, and through chapter 6, we see the heart of true Judaism and the heart of our faith. So I want us to go to, let's see, just because of time, Deuteronomy chapter 6, please. Let's turn there. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now, it's kind of interesting that later in Israel's history, there is a king by the name of Josiah. And there's going to be a revival that's going to happen in the people of God in the book of 2 Kings chapter 23. And when that revival happens, it's because they discover a copy of the book of Deuteronomy. And they begin to do what Deuteronomy says. And I think this is maybe the heart of Deuteronomy for sure. This is a text that Jesus cites. So look with me at Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel. This is called the Shema. The first Hebrew word here is hear. So if you talk to a Jewish person, they pray the Shema every day. Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai, Echad. They pray it every single day. Hear, O Israel. The Lord, our God, the Lord is one. Now, they replace the word Yahweh, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, with Adonai, because they're afraid to commit blasphemy by saying the name Yahweh out loud. We'll get into that later. That's what they pray every day. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That's Deuteronomy 6:4. And then notice verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Now it's interesting, this verse. Notice it says, Yahweh our God. Yahweh is one. Isn't that kind of weird? Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. Why does it say that, do you think? I think this is a hint at the Trinity, yeah. Unity. One, echad is the Hebrew word here, speaks of unity. In the Jewish Passover service, there is an echad container. It's kind of interesting. During the Jewish Passover, they take 3 pieces of matzah, and they put them in the echad, in the unity bag, the unity container. And so, there's 3 in 1 bag, right, unified. And one of them is wrapped in a white sheet, and then it's taken out of the unity container, and it's hidden, and then a kid goes and finds it, and he redeems it, and then everyone gets to eat of it. It's called the Afikomen, which is the only Greek word in the Passover service. It means until he comes. So why do they put 3 pieces of matzah in the echad, in the unity? Then one of them's wrapped in white, taken out. It's hidden for a while. Then it's broken, and everyone gets to eat of it. It's kind of fishy, if you ask me. Sounds like some early Christians had something to do, some meddling with the Jewish Passover, and it stuck. But anyhow, the word echad means unity. So when it says Yahweh is one, I think this is an allusion to the Trinity, yeah. And it actually is a supportive statement of the Trinity. We don't have time to get into that big time. But notice, this is exactly what Jesus said. One of the scribes, Mark 12, came up to tempt him, or they heard him disputing, and they asked him, which command is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, quoting Deuteronomy, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Some people would like to get rid of Deuteronomy out of the Bible because of some of the laws that are repeated in there. Well, if you get rid of Deuteronomy, you got to get rid of this. Love God with all your heart. And guess what else is in here? Love your neighbor as yourself. You got to get rid of those too. This is where it comes from. Deuteronomy is quoted over 80 times in the New Testament. It's the most quoted book of the law in the New Testament. 80 times plus. Very important book to the New Testament. Jesus, when he is tempted in the wilderness, quotes the Bible to Satan 3 times. Guess what section he quoted? Deuteronomy 3 times. So remember, turn these stones into bread. It is written, Satan, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4, quoting Deuteronomy. And so on and so forth. When you read Matthew 4 now, remember, Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy to repel the temptation of Satan. By the way, it's interesting that Deuteronomy was given at the end of the testing of 40 years in the wilderness, Bamidbar, right? And Jesus is how long in the wilderness? 40 days and 40 nights. And then he's tested. And unlike Israel, who failed the test, Jesus what? Passes the test with Deuteronomy as his weapon. If you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, there's so much here. I'm not even giving this close to the time justice, but I do want to keep moving. I don't want to be an Old Testament survey for the next 5 years. I really would like to do it in a year if possible. If we have to go a year and a couple months, I'm not going to complain. But I don't want to go too much longer than that, just because if we go too long, then some people will be scared to join because they missed the first half, and our numbers will keep shrinking. So that's what kind of happens. But Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. Notice this promise here. The Lord, Yahweh your Elohim, the Lord your God, will raise up for you a prophet like me, Moses says, from your midst, from your brethren. But what about this prophet is different? Him shall you what? You're going to listen to this one. How well do they listen to Moses? Not so good. But this prophet, our English Bibles tend to capitalize the word P because they know who this is referring to. Jesus. Remember, Jesus is what? Prophet, priest, and king. He is a prophet. He gives the word of the Lord. He's a prophet they're going to listen to. And the New Testament tells us in passages like Acts chapter 7 that this is Jesus. All right, 2 more thoughts, and I'm done. One of the biggest obstacles to reading Deuteronomy is the subject of holy war. Holy war. So remember, Israel's at the precipice of entering the promised land. And when they enter the promised land, they're going to have to fight. And war is never pretty, is it? I mean, there is no such thing as a good war. So there's just wars, there's not good wars. The idea of a good war is not a very helpful expression. Just war, maybe so. Good war, not so much. Because there's always bad things that happen in war. And in Deuteronomy, there is something that we encounter called the Holy Wars. We'll just use the English language for tonight. That were taking place between Israel and the pagan Canaanites. And often in these passages, we read about God telling them to wipe out the enemy. So full destruction, which really goes against modern sensibilities. It tends to make us feel like even kill the children, like everybody from this clan. Yes, we're starting fresh, which, it's easy to get angry at that, except for you got to think about the flood of Noah's day when God kind of did that there, and the animals. Or places like Sodom and Gomorrah, where God did the very same thing. And if you're still like, that doesn't prove the point, how about the end of the world when Jesus comes back and he's going to kill everybody? I mean, there are judgments that are just. So we actually believe that these are things that really happened. Yes?
My thoughts too, okay, he destroyed all these, including the children. But if they're under the age of accountability, they're going to go to heaven, right?
Yeah, so I don't like the title age of accountability, but I do believe in sovereign election. And so I think there is an argument in the Bible for the fact that, number one, there's people that have mental retardation or other mental issues where they don't have, some theologians say, a condition of accountability. But I think even more than this idea of condition or age of accountability, God is sovereign, and he can regenerate hearts that don't understand. So in his electing grace, he's very merciful to save little children that might die before they have the ability to even have intellectual faith. And God has a plan in that. So I kind of look at it more from that. It's two different lenses. One's kind of the age of accountability is very Baptist of the 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's very kind of man-centered way of expressing what I think is better expressed by saying God can overcome the resistance in the heart and the sin of a little child that dies. And God has a plan. So not only did their death not take God by surprise, but his regenerating their little heart didn't take God by surprise. He saved them and kept them to himself. Because if you strictly go by an age of accountability, you have to start asking, what in the world is the age? Is it 12? Is it 6? Is it 8? I know 4-year-olds that intellectually have faith, and I know 12-year-olds that are struggling with the ability to even intellectually have faith. I know 30-year-olds who don't. People Down syndrome and other things that they struggle. Of course, I think many people with Down syndrome sometimes have far greater faith than the rest of us. They're the normal ones, but that's another sermon for another night. So, because of God's working in their hearts and the way they worship. I've seen kids with Down syndrome in church worship far better than the rest of us. So, but that, again, another story. So yeah, I think God is sovereign, and part of this is really important to your point, because in Revelation it says around the throne of God there are people from what? Every what? Tribe, tongue, people, nation. I think that includes Canaanite tribes that never heard about Jesus. But there was little babies and children that died in some of these judgments. And God sovereignly saved them in spite of their parents' rebellion, because he's a God of grace. That's a big theological concept to just drop on you. But yeah, so I think God's sovereign, and yes, he is faithful and merciful. Spurgeon uses the title of elect infants. I like that title. I think that's They very possibly would have rebelled. They would have been taught to reject God. And you think of Jesus picking up the little ones and blessing them like there's some good in them. God is very merciful to regenerate. So, what I want to show you, though, is there was a reason why. Okay, I'm not going to have you turn because of time, but I'll show you one instance. Why does God command these kind of laws? Well, in Deuteronomy Chapter 12, it says, "You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. For every abominable thing that Yahweh hates, they, the Canaanites in this land, have done." Notice this. This is how far degenerate these societies were. They are burning their sons and their daughters in fire to the Lord. This is the worship of Moloch. They would take and burn their children alive. Sometimes at birth, sometimes in their young ages. They would take them and throw them. We read in the Torah about them taking the heads of the infants and dashing them against a stone in pagan worship to these gods, which sounds a lot to me like the modern abortion industry. But that's
Was that Baal? Was that also Baal?
not Baal, but Moloch and the Asherim, which is the female version of Baal. Baal had very wicked practices too. So yeah. Yes, these are what the gods of the Canaanites were, and they were practicing very abominable things. So there was a very strong judgment, I think, to clean the land, because God knew that Israel would commit the same acts. All right, last thing to see. All right, I so wish we had more time to think on these things, but last thing to see. So, one of the covenantal laws to close out about holy wars and the kings is found in Deuteronomy 21. So, you go into one of these Canaanite cities, and you battle against them. If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, you hang him on a tree. Notice this. His body shall not remain all night on the tree. You shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is what? Cursed by God. You shall not defile the land that your God is giving you. In the fullness of time, knowing that the entire world would be blessed, the Holy Son of God bore the judgment of God's curse by being crucified outside the holy city upon a tree, and his body was taken down before sundown. Most crucifixion victims were left on for days, taken down before sundown. And with his resurrection, a new world has begun in which everyone that has faith in him, the curse that the one hung on the tree is reversed, and they are blessed by the Messiah. So even these laws of holy war, which are very devastating and strong laws, point forward to what Jesus endured on the cross. So not only Israel would be saved, but so all the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations would be saved. That's just one small snippet of a very grander theme that, again, we could spend a lot of time. And I have a sermon on holy wars somewhere dealing with hard parts in the Bible on YouTube if you want to listen to it. So, all right, any questions as you've been patient and we have went over, and so much over that the security team left. I think one's left. All right. No questions, time to pray.